Hello and welcome to the third video of Chapter 1, covering sections 1.4 and 1.5. In section 1.4, we'll be looking at why evolution is relevant to anatomy and physiology, how evolution and natural selection are related but different from each other, how many of our current human characteristics are related to characteristics of earlier tree-dwelling primates, and how some of our current characteristics are related to the transition to primates walking upright on two legs. At the end of this video, for section 1.5, you should be able to describe the levels of structure from the simplest to the most complex, or vice versa. You should be able to differentiate between reductionist and holistic viewpoints, and you should be able to summarize why anatomical variation between humans is really important in the study of anatomy and physiology. Charles Darwin is arguably the most influential biologist of all time. His work described how species originate and change over time. And in short, his ideas about natural selection tell us how evolution happens. When his work was published in the mid-1800s, it was really controversial and to some degree remains controversial today because it changes our view of nature, of human origin, and of humans' place in the world as a whole. So let's start with some definitions. Evolution can be defined as how the genetic composition of a population of organisms changes over time. And there are tons of definitions or examples of evolution that can be pretty readily observed. There's a really famous example of moths during the Industrial Revolution and how as trees became dark gray because of pollution and soot deposits on the tree, all of the white moths were killed off by predators and the population swung towards dark moths being prevalent. And then laws were enacted to prevent pollution, and the trees went back to their original light gray color, and all the dark gray moths were eaten by the predators, and the population changed its genetic composition to be mostly white moths again. In healthcare right now, we're very concerned about bacteria being resistant to antibiotics. That's an example of evolution over time. We can even observe humans evolving just in the last couple hundred years. We have really good evidence from Civil War records, and in particular Civil War uniform sizes, that human males are taller and heavier now than they were in the 1860s. So populations change over time. I want to make it very clear that an individual cannot evolve, okay? An individual cannot change its own personal genetics over the course of its life. Changes in genetics are called cancer, and we'll be talking about that much more later on. So evolution happens to populations, never to individuals. Natural selection is how evolution works. It's the engine that makes evolution go. So a population is met with selection pressures, things that make some individuals better able to survive and reproduce than others, and some individuals not reproduce at all, most likely because they died before they reached reproductive age. Okay, so if we look at an example of predators that are fast, the prey animals that are faster than the predators are more likely to survive and reproduce than the prey species, the individuals of the prey species that are slower than the predators. They're likely to die before they are able to reproduce. Okay, so a phrase that we often hear when we talk about natural selection and selection pressures is survival of the fittest. Okay, we've all heard this, survival of the fittest. I want to make it really, really clear that survival of the fittest isn't talking about the strongest or necessarily the fastest individuals. When we say fittest, in this case, we're meaning most fit for the environment. In some cases, the fittest thing may be the smallest. If that gives an evolutionary advantage, the individuals who are smaller can hide or evade predators better. And the final big picture concept we need to talk about here is adaptations. So adaptations are inherited traits that can allow an organism to survive and reproduce more, to be more reproductively successful. Okay, so a key here is it's inherited. It's not something that the individual does over the course of their life. Something that's inherited that can help them survive better. So better camouflage is an example of an adaptation. Speed is an example of an adaptation. If there's some courtship ritual dancing that some species do and some individuals are better at that, that could be an adaptation. So now we're jumping into human evolution. When we look at DNA analysis, we find that humans' closest relatives are chimps. They share 98.4% of their DNA structure. To compare, gorillas and chimps share 97.7% of their DNA. So chimps are more closely related to humans than chimps are to gorillas. When we study evolutionary relationships, the reason that we're concerned about this is we want to make good choices when we're choosing animal models for medical research. So we use a lot of mice and rats in medical research because they're much cheaper to keep than chimpanzees, and there are some significant ethical issues with using chimpanzees in medical research because chimpanzees are so similar to us. We wouldn't want to choose an animal model that is vastly different from us with hugely different organ systems. A snail, for instance, would be a very poor choice for a medical model, research model in most cases. Humans, monkeys, and apes are all primates. There are actually more than 300 species under the umbrella of primates. They are all placental mammals that have opposable thumbs and good eyesight. Early primates were what we call arboreal. That means they lived in trees. Evidence for this, mobile shoulders, okay? Think about how big of a circle your arm can move in. Dogs can't move their shoulders, cats can't move their shoulders anywhere near the range of motion that humans have. And that comes from our ancestors being able to move from branch to branch in trees. Okay, opposable thumbs or grasping hands are carryovers from early primates. Eyes that are on the front of our faces, not on the side, give us three-dimensional vision, depth perception, at the cost of wider peripheral vision. That's generally a trait of predator species rather than prey species. Primates in general have very good color vision, and research shows that this is likely the result of being able or needing to find ripe fruit that can only be distinguished by slight variations in color. And finally, primates, generally speaking, have large brains, especially the portions of the brains that are devoted to memory formation and storage. And we think this relates to needing to be able to find food sources and remember where different food sources were located. So this is a really interesting depiction of a couple of the adaptations that primates have, and humans in particular. So the grasping hands with the opposable thumb and the eyes facing forward, also the large skull and use of tools. Fossil evidence shows that bipedalism, or walking upright, was really well established in primates as long as 4 million years ago. And we can see this in fossil evidence from the anatomy of pelvis, femur bones, knees, toes, foot arches, and spinal columns that we have from early humans. At the same time as early humans were transitioning to bipedalism, there was also a concurrent increase in brain volume. So we had these two changes going on simultaneously. We had changes to spinal cord and hips and legs, and at the same time increased brain volume, allowing for us to learn more and have a better functioning memory. These two things at the same time made giving birth much more difficult. And one of the really interesting things is experts believe that humans are born relatively helpless compared to other species' offspring, and we have more of a community living situation with an extended family structure. And these things relate back directly to the adaptation of walking upright. The adaptation of walking upright allowed us to carry food or infants or weapons, and it gave considerable advantages to our early ancestors. So before we were talking about the order of primates. If you guys remember, the order of organizing species is kingdom, phylum, class, order. We were talking about order before. Family, genus, species. So things that are in the same genus are going to be more closely related than things that are only in the same order. Okay, so primates is our order, and this slide is talking about genus, the very specific close relative that we're discussing here. Okay, so the first bipedal primate genus that we have fossil records of was called Australopithecus, and those fossils are from more than 3 million years ago. 2.5 million years ago, a different genus appeared. So this genus, we call it Homo. Homo means same. Okay, so the Homo genus has several species in it. The Homo genus shared characteristics include being taller in height, having a larger brain volume, and being able to make tools. So Homo erectus was an earlier group within the Homo genus, an earlier species, and they appear in the fossil record 1.8 million years ago, and they were the early human species that migrated away from Africa and into parts of the Middle East and Asia. Then, only 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appear in the fossil record and have persisted till today. So I want to make one point here. I taught high school for a lot of years, and I've heard this so many times. People get very defensive when someone says humans came from apes. It is a false statement, and someone who tells you that is either uneducated or is trying to get you angry. Humans did not come from apes. Humans have a common ancestor with apes. Okay? That means that humans and other primates have an ancestor that was one species, and over time, selection pressures drove evolution in different directions. Kind of like cousins having the same grandfather, not one person magically turning into another person. Okay? We're talking about a common ancestor here that adapted to different environments through the process of natural selection to eventually, for long periods of time, become separate independent species. So that is going to conclude our discussion of human evolution. Now we're moving on to section 1.5 and human structure. So we have written description and a graphical description here. It's important that you guys be able to work either from biggest to smallest or from smallest to biggest. You could be expected to do either one of those on an exam, so please be prepared for both. Let's work from, I like to go from smallest to biggest first. Let's start there. We can start with here, atoms. So atoms, you guys know, are anything that's individually written on the periodic table, and they can combine in a couple different ways that we'll be talking about later to form molecules. And those molecules can be really simple, from two oxygens joining together to be the oxygen that we breathe, to much more complex with carbohydrates or proteins. Those molecules can become macromolecules, and there are 4 macromolecules, generally speaking. We have lipids and carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids, and those things join together to form organelles. Okay? So organelles are microscopic, and they're found inside of cells. Some good examples of those that I'm sure you guys have heard of are mitochondria or lysosomes, and the nucleus of the cell is another good organelle to think of as representing these. The smallest units that can be considered alive are cells. Okay, so there are many single-celled organisms, and also a lot of organisms that are multicellular, that are collections of cells working together. So from here on out, we're talking about multicellular things. When we have a multicellular thing that has cells joined together into tissues, so a tissue is defined as a mass of cell and cell products that perform a certain function and make up a discrete region of the body or of the organ. Okay, so that is a tissue. Tissues make up organs where 2 or more types of tissues work together to carry out a particular function. When many organs work together to carry out a complex task such as digestion or coordinating body movements, like muscular movements, that is then an organ system. When all of the organ systems come together into a fully functioning, in this case, human anatomy and physiology, we have an organism. We can work the other direction as well. We can start with an organism, a human, maybe a human baby, and we can talk about the organ system of the nervous system. And that system is going to be composed of the brain and the spinal cord and all of the peripheral nerves. Then maybe the organ that we are concerned with is the brain. So we're looking at one organ out of the organ system. We're looking at the brain. And the brain is made up of several types of tissues. It has nervous tissue, neurons. It has connective tissue that hold the hemispheres of the brain together. And it also has blood vessels. Okay, and then we can drop down to the cellular level. And at the cellular level, we can look at one neuron with its axon at one end and dendrites at the other end. And it's one functioning cell. We can drop down further, and as organelles, we can see the nucleus, and we can see some mitochondria and some lysosomes and some peroxisomes within that neuron. Within that neuron, we have proteins being made. We have a lipid membrane. We have carbohydrates as a fuel source, glucose to help the brain function. And we have DNA in the nucleus. And then we can drop down further to the molecule level. and we'll see there's some water in there and some lipid molecules and some protein molecules. And those things are further composed of single atoms. Okay, so for this, I would really recommend, if you guys are studying, pick an organ system of the human body and then choose an organ and try to figure out what all of the different tissues, cells, organelles are that could make up that organ system. So we have two overarching ways of looking at this hierarchy. Okay, we can look at the large complex system, and we can break it down into all of the smaller parts and pieces and look smaller and smaller and smaller and get into the microscopic structures and the biochemistry that is going on between those structures. And that would be reductionism, looking at the smallest, most reduced pieces. The opposite of that is holism. And in holism, we look at the sum of the parts all together. And in most cases, we want to find that the sum of the parts is greater than the individual contributions of the parts, that there's a type of synergy there that we can evaluate and study. And the last thing that we're going to talk about in this section 1.5 is anatomical variation. This is really interesting stuff. So when we look at an anatomy textbook, when we take an introductory anatomy and physiology course, we're looking at the most common way things are seen. We're looking at normal. The fun starts when we start to study things that are not normal. Okay, so one thing that has a lot of variation is human kidneys. So normally we have two human kidneys. They are located pretty high up in the abdominal cavity, kind of underneath, below the rib cage. It's not uncommon, though, for one kidney to be much lower in the pelvic region than the other. There's also this not super rare structure where the person has one kidney and it spans from one side of the abdominal cavity to the other. There are also variations in the number of ureters that kidneys can have and the number of renal arteries that bring blood to the kidneys that kidneys can have. Okay, we can also pretty commonly see variations in the branching of the aorta around a heart, and we have some diagrams here. And then another really interesting case, it happens in 1 out of 8,000 births on average, is something called situs inversus. And that means that the left and the right organs are all backwards. It's like the person's internal organs are a mirror image of what we would expect them to be. Normally, this situation, this situs inversus, is absolutely harmless. And a lot of people don't even realize they have this going on until they're older and they have some sort of pain or disease, and they need a CT scan or an MRI to figure out what's going on. So normally, this is not a problem unless the person presents with symptoms and a physician is trying to make a diagnosis. Everybody knows that pain on the right side of the abdomen can often be an appendix or an appendix that is inflamed about to rupture. If a person presents with pain on the left side and doesn't know that they have this situs inversus, they could be misdiagnosed. It could be, their diagnosis could be could take longer than otherwise it would have because this condition wasn't known. So, in summary, we are learning about standard normal anatomy, and we have to learn that in order to recognize and be able to work through the causes and effects of abnormal anatomy.